So when you go in and you talk to these guys, when Tom's trying to figure out what he can do with federal dollars, with school improvement grant dollars, or Title I or special ed, he's turning to his deputies. And the problem is all of these people have been steeped and socialized in the same world. They've all started out as teachers. Almost every one of them is going to have gotten their advanced training in a master's in education or a doctorate education program. They've been socialized by the way business is done. So frankly, you just find very few people in positions of responsibility who can say, wait a minute, there is an entirely different interpretation of what we have to do with special ed dollars. Or we can think real differently about how we use Title I. These guys just don't have access to that. So one of the things that we need to get much better at is helping to infuse even reform-minded districts with wholly different ways of thinking about how do you slice up the challenge. Because usually we're going to have better schools. We know what makes better schools: stronger leaders, better teachers. So we're immediately working with all the same definitions and boxes and just trying to do them a little bit better. And in my experience, it's not the way most organizations really take a big leap. If all you're doing is trying to optimize what you're doing, you're going to get modest. So that's one. Second thing is, I think, a huge challenge right now, I think statewide, is implementing 191. And you guys are ahead of everybody else in terms of thinking this stuff through, and Mike is fabulous. And it strikes me that the kind of process you put in place makes a lot of sense. But it's also the fact that right now all the rhetoric kind of goes one way. All the rhetoric is, we want to measure performance of educators. And the better we can measure, the more telling this is. And what we can measure is grade 3 to 8 reading and math. We got to find analogous measures elsewhere. It makes me it ticks off my friends in the reform world sometimes. But look, I think we need to be really careful about how far you want to push on that, for a couple reasons. One, it reminds me a lot more of how Fuller Brush salesmen and encyclopedia salesmen were evaluated in the 1950s than it does how kind of high-performing firms that I know, the Googles and the Facebooks and the Oracles, actually manage their talent today. So it's better than where we've been, but I'm not sure it's where I want to see us be in 2020 or 2021. So one, how do we make sure that we don't imagine that implementing 191 is the end game, but how do we think of this as a step forward towards a more quality-conscious mindset, and one where we're constantly trying to think what are other ways to tap into and measure talent? How are we using parental surveys in a systematic, rigorous way to get information on whether teachers are good at communicating with families and keeping them in the loop? How are we building in and observing principal judgment so that we're actually allowing school leaders to make informed, subjective decisions about the staff who work for them? The other big problem with the way we're doing stuff like value added is if you think about what I regard as some of the more interesting models out there, say hybrid schools, where we're starting to not just have kids learn from a teacher, but where kids are doing a couple of hours of instruction from computer assisted or online. Or if you think about the School of One in New York City, which you may have heard of, where we unpack the math curriculum for grades 6 to 8, and instead of 25 kids getting marched through the curriculum, there's now 89 learning objectives. We pre-test them at the end of the previous year. We skip all the ones you already know, and we start mixing and matching with teachers and technology to teach you what you don't know to accelerate you. None of this actually works under 191 because we've just blown up all of the assumption that a teacher is going to own an identifiable group of kids for an academic year. So the more you start to do these hybrid or kind of creative models, the less you can actually rely on the metrics that were being generated by end of year tests to gauge value added. That doesn't mean we throw out the concept of value added, but it means we've got to get much more agile and nimble about it and not let how we measure determine how we solve the problem. I want how we solve the problem to determine how we measure. And then a third thing, which is I think just key, is making sure that we're pushing, educators think in terms of school leaders and teachers. That's all they know. But we created the notion of modern teacher back in the early 19th century because we needed cheap labor to fill these schools where we were going to make Irish kids read the King James Bible. Until in 1810, 90% of America's teachers were men. Teaching was an itinerant profession you did for a couple of years before you went on to do something else. We turned it into a 30-year profession done by women who'd been trained in ed schools because they were cheap, because we wouldn't let them do anything else. Well, since 1950s, 55% of college-educated women became teachers. Today it's 15%. So the labor force has shifted dramatically, but when you talk to educators, their notion of how do we solve the teacher quality challenge still relies on the same descriptions and the same solutions. We've got to find good people, we're either going to make them TFAers for 2 or 3 or 4 years, or we're going to make them career-long teachers. But there's a teaching job, and we want to plug people into that, and we want to get really good ones and turn them into school leaders. And part of the question is, how do we start thinking about teaching rather than teacher job? There's an outfit called Citizen Schools up in Boston, which says, look, in any urban community nowadays, you've got thousands of educated professionals who want to be involved in teaching. Doesn't mean they want to quit their job and become teachers, but they would love to teach. And it turns out they'll do it for free. So what Citizen Schools has done is created a mechanism whereby in extended learning time schools, because we still got to deal with contracts about who's allowed to teach from the school day. In extended learning time schools, what they do is they set up structured instruction where professionals in the community will come in and teach a semester, 9 weeks, 13 weeks, 2 hours a day, 1 day a week after school. Not much more of a commitment than a firm has to make for somebody who's going to be a reading mentor. And you get attorneys and architects and engineers, and they come in and they teach these middle schoolers a course. And you've got strong role models from the community. You've got people who aren't educators, which can have a beneficial effect on kids. Kids will relate to them differently. You tap the kind of expertise, and you tap it for free. So part of, I think, how we need to think about what it means to improve teaching and leadership is not just working within the old boxes and the old figures, but thinking creatively about America in the 21st century. What's out there and how do we bring it in and take advantage of it? And that's stuff that educators left to their own devices aren't going to do, but that's exactly the kind of stuff that the business has found itself having to wrestle with day in, day out for decades.